Islam is not an ethnicity, it's not a nationality, it's a religion.
Within the Muslim community, we see a lot of anti-Semitism, we do see sexism, and we do see homophobia.
It's amazing, Gideon, that you never even bother to read the rest of Islam, what Islam talks about.
We will additionally be paying huge amounts of money to self-appointed Muslim representatives, usually the big mouths from their communities, who decide that they speak for Islam.
For most of the last couple of hundred years, the overwhelming majority of British subjects were neither white nor Christian. This is not a new issue.
Our Shared Europe is a big project organised by the British Council which tries to look at the trust gap, if you like, between Muslim Europeans and non-Muslim Europeans, which we believe is actually getting wider in many cases, but not all cases. There are good stories to tell and there are bad stories, but I think there's a problem of understanding and knowledge and trust that it should be worrying us all, and Our Shared Europe is our attempt to put together a response to that.
Start off by welcoming you all to the European Parliament today. I do believe this to be an appropriate venue to face the challenging debates and take a lead on debating Islam's relationship with Europe. Well, working with the British Council on an issue of identity was something that seemed like a perfect way in which we could share our resources to put on an event of this sort here in the European Parliament.
So I'm going to kickstart this thing, and I'm going to ask a very, very general question of Chris Allen. We talk about a shared Europe, and that's the British Council project. Do we actually have one?
Really, when we talk about sharing Europe and a shared Europe and the sort of identity around that, I think that we need to sort of differentiate that from the fact that we can, within that, have different nationalities, different ethnicities, different religions, different sort of social standing and so on. You know, what we really do need to do is just remember that when we share Europe, it doesn't mean that we can't share Europe without being different.
We fret a lot about identity. Is that an indication that Europe itself feels very fragile about its own identity?
Of course some people feel tremendously European, but they are a tiny number. The number of people who feel European in the same way that somebody might feel Canadian or Norwegian or Japanese is tiny. Our topic today is about Islam and Europe, Islam and identity. Let me say, if I may, a couple of words about that. And I'll say these in a British context, because I don't think I'm really qualified to talk about the Islamic experience in Belgium or Germany. But it's sometimes posited as a new issue, this. For most of the last couple of hundred years, the overwhelming majority of British subjects were neither white nor Christian. This is not a new issue. The single most common complaint that I've had from Muslim constituents in the southeast of England, which I represent, is media misrepresentation. In the British Conservative delegation, we have two Muslim MEPs, Sajjad, who you heard from earlier, and Syed Kamal. But how often do you get them on Newsnight? There are lots and lots of elected Muslim representatives in the United Kingdom who have, by definition, achieved a certain representativeness if they are councillors or MPs or MEPs. And those are the people we ought to be hearing from. And if you did hear from them more, you would get, I put it to you, a very different view of that which you get on television. The most common sentiment I've had expressed to me by Muslim constituents in my part of the world is, this is the best place in the world for a Muslim to live. You can practice your religion freely, but you have the full civic freedoms of the law. I've never once heard a genuine person saying to me on the doorstep, actually, I think we could do with a slightly Iranian kind of legal system. Right? You only ever hear that in the mouth of one of these people who is portrayed as a spokesman or as a community leader, although he's never actually been elected or to anything or chosen to represent anyone. Sometimes some of the bigger Muslim organizations haven't helped themselves, in the sense that when there is a terrorist atrocity, quite often you would have the relevant spokesman saying, well, yeah, of course this is terrible and we condemn it, but they would then go on to make criticisms of British foreign policy in Iraq or in Palestine. Now, those criticisms may be perfectly valid, But the aftermath of a terrorist attack isn't the time to express them.
So are European Muslims going through a crisis of identity? Is the identity of European Muslims actually being formed?
First of all, there is no such thing called European Muslims. They are Muslim communities living in Europe. There's a very big differentiation. Islam is not an ethnicity, it's not a nationality, it's a religion, and it's very privately based religion. Now, I can tell you with utmost confidence that the Muslim communities in Europe at large have no issue with their own identities, and they definitely do not have any crisis in their identity. They have a very solid identity. Having said that, there are certain other things which Muslim communities are discussing. For example, what role Islam should play in their daily lives, how should they adopt native cultures, and how should they live with their neighbors. They are very concerned with smooth upbringing and education of their children. And they're also very concerned with these so-called anti-terror laws and youth alienation and radicalization. These are the issues they are working with. Now, you said that how are Muslims forming their identity? First of all, again, there is no such thing called Muslim identity. I believe that this description is labeled on them by misleading media, populist politicians, and some of them also sit in European Parliament too. And unfortunately, European intellectual and Christian churches who have their own political agenda and historical agenda. Muslim communities in Europe comprise of 60 nationalities, cultures, and ethnicities. They are as different as most Europeans are. To me, it is not the issue of Muslims forming their identities as they wish, but what identity the society is willing to bestow upon them. In choosing one's identity, 95% individuals among Muslim communities are totally dependent on the goodwill of the Europeans. And that goodwill is getting smaller and smaller by the day. So I do wish to be a European if Europe let me to be a European. Thank you.
I think very interesting. What identity is Europe willing to bestow on Muslims? And is goodwill becoming smaller and smaller? So I think those are the questions I'd ask Douglas.
The options we have in Europe seem to me to be twofold to deal with this issue. One is to do the following, which is broadly speaking what we are doing across the continent at the moment. It is to decide that there is a serious problem with Islamic fundamentalism which we have noticed, and as a result, for the rest of time, we will be discussing Islam. Muslims, Muslim communities. We will be having many, many seminars like this one. There will be a dialogue that goes on endlessly, and we will additionally be paying huge amounts of money to self-appointed Muslim representatives, usually the big mouths from their communities, who decide that they speak for Islam. They will, by and large, also be more radical than the people they claim to speak for. And as a result, the whole dialogue will be skewed. That's one possibility. That's what we're doing at the moment. And we've seen the problem from that again and again. We keep on making the same mistake over and over again. The second option is that Europe itself, Europeans, are better at saying what it is we believe in, what it is we are, that is, people of all faiths and none, and say where we draw the line. It's noticeable to my mind that that isn't happening at the moment. Islam is, I'm the first to concede, exceedingly complex, is not homogeneous, has very many confused ideas within it, as indeed does Europe. But there's no point in solely beating up on Europe in such a debate and solely praising Islam, because praise and indeed blame have to be shared around at least equally. But addressing Islam and saying that racism and Islamophobia can be brought together in the way they have been in recent years is, to my mind, very troubling for the following reason. I'm an atheist. I have no dog in the religious fight, as it were. But it is Islamophobic if I state the fact that I think that Muhammad very evidently made up the Quran. I also believe, by the way, that Moses didn't come down from the mountain with any engraved stones, and I think it less likely that Mary, the mother of Jesus, had a child for the first time without any interjection of the male and more likely that a young Jewish girl told a fib. But of these three things, which to my mind are perfectly obvious, I believe that Christians and Jews put up with hearing that most of the time, and I don't get called a Christophobe or a Judeophobe for saying so, but an Islamophobe straight off, absolutely. As I say, racism does exist, and we should be addressing that in our societies, but Islamophobia, as such, is a crock term. It is not to have any special seminar, any special hearing, any special vocal representatives. As an immigrant friend of mine always puts it, the moment when you know you're really integrated is when you realize that being a citizen consists of simply putting up with the same old crap the rest of us have to put up with. And that's it.
I'd like Chris to come in on one issue. You said Islamophobia a crock term, and since Chris is one of the authors, one of the people who actually defined this term, at least as far as I'm concerned, I'd like you to come in and answer that, please, Chris.
In terms of Islamophobia, I think that Douglas raises an interesting point, and I think that it was touched upon by some of my other colleagues around the media. And I think that just to give some statistics on that, I was commissioned to do some research by the Greater London Authority a year after the 7/7 tube bombings, and we looked at the British press on a day-to-day basis, where we counted the number of articles which were related to Islam, the amount of articles which were related to Muslims, and comparing that to a piece of research that was done between 94 and 96 by Elizabeth Paul. In 2006, we found that the amount of coverage of Muslim and Islam had increased by 270% in that 10-year period. We found that 91% of that news coverage was actually negative.